Sometimes the strongest among us fall the hardest, and when they do, we learn who we truly are by how we treat them. In the frozen lands of ancient Norway, no sight was more heartbreaking than watching a giant warrior reduced to helplessness, abandoned by those he once protected. Torsten Fellhand had been the mightiest fighter in all of Skarnheim. His warhammer crushed enemies, and his battle cry echoed across the fjords. But when he returned from battle with a shattered spine and useless legs, everything changed. The jarl declared him worthless. The healers refused to help. Even his closest friends walked away. In their harsh world, a warrior who could not fight was left to die in the snow. But one person refused to abandon him. Yrsa was just a slave maiden, powerless and forgotten. Yet she had secret knowledge of healing herbs and broken bones. While the entire clan turned their backs, she alone dared to help the fallen giant. What would make a slave risk everything to save a warrior the whole world had given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the fjord like the voices of the dishonored dead, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of another brutal winter. Skarnheim had weathered countless seasons in these northern reaches, its wooden halls and stone foundations carved from the very bones of the earth by men who knew that survival meant strength, and strength meant everything. For 30 years, Torsten Fellhand had embodied that strength. His name was spoken in whispers around enemy fires, a legend that grew with each passing season. 7 feet of muscle and bone, with arms thick as ship masts and hands that could crush a man's skull like an egg. His warhammer, forged from iron pulled from the deep mountains, had never known defeat. Warriors from distant lands had come, seeking glory by facing him in combat, only to find themselves broken and forgotten beneath the northern stars. The great hall of Skarnheim bore testament to his victories. Shields of fallen enemies hung from the rafters, their painted surfaces telling stories of battles fought across frozen seas and mountain passes. At the head table, where Jarl Magnus held court, Torsten's chair sat larger than all others, carved from the trunk of an ancient oak and decorated with silver taken from defeated Saxon nobles. For 3 decades, no man had dared challenge his right to sit there, but chairs meant nothing to a man who could no longer walk. The slave quarters lay in the shadow of the great hall, a collection of low buildings where the captured and conquered made their homes in whatever comfort they could find. Here, the hierarchy of Skarnheim meant little. A former Saxon nobleman slept beside a captured Irish fisherman, their past lives reduced to the simple reality of servitude. They were fed, clothed, and housed. For the Norse understood that healthy slaves were profitable slaves, but they remained property nonetheless. Yrsa had lived in these quarters for 8 years, since the raid that claimed her village and her freedom. She had been barely 16 then, taken from the coastal settlements of Scotland, where her grandmother had taught her the old ways. Not the ways of sword and shield, but the gentler arts that most warriors scorned, the knowledge of which plants could heal a fever, how to set a broken bone, the careful balance of herbs that could ease pain or bring peaceful sleep. In Skarnheim, such knowledge was viewed with suspicion. The clan's official healers were old men who relied on iron tools and harsh remedies, cutting and burning to drive out sickness. They spoke of honor and strength, even when treating wounds, as if admitting to gentleness might somehow weaken their spirits. Yrsa had learned to keep her knowledge hidden, helping fellow slaves in secret when sickness struck the quarters, never speaking of the small miracles she performed with careful hands and patient heart. She was unremarkable to look upon, which had proven both blessing and curse. Her brown hair fell straight to her shoulders, often braided simply to keep it from her work. Her face was pleasant but not striking, with grey eyes that seemed to notice everything while drawing little attention. She stood average height for a woman, neither tall enough to intimidate nor small enough to appear helpless. In a culture that prized dramatic beauty or obvious strength, Yrsa had found safety in being overlooked. Her hands, however, told a different story. Long fingers moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years working with delicate things. Small scars marked her palms from gathering thorny herbs, and her fingertips were stained with the subtle colors of roots and berries she had ground for healing purposes. These hands had delivered babies in the slave quarters, eased the passing of the elderly, and mended wounds that the official healers had declared beyond hope. Jarl Magnus ruled Skarnheim with the wisdom of experience and the hardness of necessity. At 65, he had seen enough seasons to know that survival in these harsh lands required difficult choices. His grey beard was kept trimmed and neat, and his weathered face spoke of a man who had made peace with the weight of leadership. He was not cruel by nature, but he understood that showing weakness, even mercy, could invite challenges to his authority that might destroy them all. The Jarl's council consisted of the clan's most trusted warriors and advisors. Eric the Redbeard served as his chief lieutenant, a man whose tactical mind had won them victories when brute force alone would have failed. Gunnar the Wise handled the clan's trade negotiations, ensuring they had the supplies needed for long winters. Olaf Ironside commanded their defenses, his scarred face, testament to countless battles survived. These men had followed Magnus for decades, their loyalty earned through shared hardship and mutual respect. But even loyalty had its limits when it came to harsh practicalities. In the world of Skarnheim, a warrior's worth was measured by his ability to fight, to protect the clan, to stand against enemies when the long ships appeared on the horizon. A man who could not hold a weapon, who could not stand in the shield wall, who required care rather than providing protection, such a man became a burden that the clan could not afford to carry. The diagnosis had been swift and merciless. When Torsten had been carried back from the mountain pass, his legs lifeless and unmoving, the clan's healers had examined him with grim efficiency. His spine had been shattered by the falling rocks, they declared. The damage was complete and permanent. No amount of iron tools or harsh remedies could restore what had been broken so thoroughly. The gods have taken his warrior spirit, old Bjorn the healer had pronounced, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years treating battlefield wounds. What remains is merely flesh, no different from a lame horse that cannot pull its weight. The comparison had stung more than any physical wound. In their society, a horse that could not run was quickly put out of its misery. The fact that no one had suggested the same for Torsten was perhaps the only mercy he could expect. Yrsa had watched from the shadows as the great warrior was carried to a small hut on the edge of the settlement, far from the great hall where his chair would sit empty. She had seen the careful way the men avoided looking directly at him, as if his condition might somehow spread to them. She had witnessed the uncomfortable silence that fell over the great hall during the evening meal, where his absence hung like a storm cloud over the gathering. But more than anything, she had seen his eyes. In those dark depths, where once had burned the fierce joy of battle, now dwelt something she recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had lost not just their body, but their very sense of who they were. She had seen it in fellow slaves when they first arrived, that hollow stare of someone whose entire world had been stripped away. The difference was that slaves could sometimes find new purpose, new identity in their changed circumstances. A warrior who could not fight had lost the very core of his being. The first night after his return, Yrsa had crept through the darkness to the small hut where Torsten lay alone. She had told herself she was merely curious, that she wanted to see for herself how completely the mighty had fallen. But as she peered through the small window, she saw something that changed everything. Torsten Fellhand, the terror of battlefields, the giant who had never known defeat, was weeping silently in the darkness. Not the angry tears of frustration, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who had given up entirely. His massive frame, which had once filled doorways and commanded respect through sheer presence, now seemed somehow diminished, as if his spirit had been the source of his physical grandeur. In that moment, Yrsa made a decision that would define both their fates. She could not undo what had been done to him, could not restore his legs, or give him back his warrior's pride. But she could offer something that no one else in Skarnheim was willing to give, the simple dignity of not being abandoned. She had waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the guards dozed at their posts, before making her move. From her carefully hidden collection of healing supplies, herbs gathered during brief moments of freedom, roots traded for favors with other slaves, preparations made in the dark hours, when sleep eluded her, she selected what she would need. Not to heal his broken spine, for that was beyond any mortal power, but to ease the pain that kept him wakeful, and the infections that threatened to claim what life remained to him. The risk was enormous. A slave caught stealing, for that was how they would view her, taking supplies to help Torsten faced severe punishment. At best, she might lose meals for weeks. At worst, she could find herself cast out into the winter wilderness, left to die as surely as if she had been executed outright. But as she prepared her small bundle of medicines, Yrsa found herself thinking not of the risk, but of her grandmother's words, spoken in the firelight of their small Scottish cottage so many years ago. The measure of a person is not in what they can take, child, but in what they choose to give when they have nothing left to lose. Hidden beneath her simple woolen cloak, Yrsa carried more than herbs and healing salves. She carried the belief that even in the harshest world, even when surrounded by those who valued only strength and conquest, there remained room for gentleness, for mercy, for the quiet courage of choosing compassion over safety. The wind continued to howl across the fjord as she made her way through the darkness, her footsteps silent on the frost-covered ground. Behind her lay the safety of anonymity, the comfortable obscurity of being just another forgotten slave. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of discovering whether the strength to heal might prove as powerful as the strength to destroy. The first touch of winter dawn painted the sky the color of old blood when Yrsa approached Torsten's hut. Her breath formed small clouds in the bitter air, and frost crunched beneath her feet despite her careful steps. The settlement remained wrapped in sleep, save for the occasional snore drifting from the great hall or the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore. She paused at the wooden door, her hand trembling not from cold, but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. Inside lay a man who could crush her with one hand, even in his weakened state. A man whose rage at his condition might turn toward anyone foolish enough to witness his helplessness. A man whose pride had been built on never needing help from anyone, least of all a slave. But through the thin walls, she could hear something that made her decision final. The ragged breathing of someone fighting pain in silence, too proud to cry out but unable to find rest. It was a sound she knew well from the slave quarters, where showing weakness could mean losing what little safety one possessed. The door opened with barely a whisper. Torsten's massive warhammer lay propped against the wall just inside, its iron head still stained with the blood of his last battle. The weapon seemed to watch her enter, a silent guardian of its fallen master's former glory. Torsten himself lay on a simple wooden bed frame, his body covered by rough wool blankets that could not disguise the powerful build that had made him legendary. His dark hair, usually braided for battle, hung loose around his shoulders. His face, weathered by countless campaigns, was tight with the kind of pain that comes not just from wounds, but from the soul-deep agony of losing everything that defined you. His eyes opened at her approach, sharp blue eyes that had struck fear into enemies across the known world. For a moment they held confusion, as if he could not understand why anyone would dare enter this place of shame. Then recognition dawned, followed quickly by something darker. "Get out!" His voice was a low growl, roughened by nights of sleepless torment. Even weakened, it carried an authority that had commanded armies. "Whatever you seek here, slave, you will not find it." Yrsa stopped where she stood, but did not retreat. She had expected this reaction, had even prepared for it. In her experience, the proud were often the most difficult to help, their pain made worse by the humiliation of needing assistance. "I seek nothing, Lord Torsten," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I come only to bring what might ease your suffering." "My suffering." His laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Look around you, girl. Do you see suffering, or do you see justice? The gods have spoken. The mighty Torsten Fellhand, who thought himself invincible, has been brought low by falling rocks. Perhaps this is what I deserve for my pride." She saw him then, not as the legendary warrior of clan songs, but as a man drowning in despair so complete that he had begun to welcome it as punishment. It was a dangerous state of mind, one that could lead a person to refuse all help, to embrace their destruction as somehow fitting. "May I approach?" she asked, gesturing to the small bundle she carried. "I have brought medicines that might help with the pain." "Pain?" Torsten's voice rose slightly, and she saw anger flicker in his eyes, the first real emotion she had witnessed from him since his return. "Do you think this is about pain, slave? Do you imagine that some herb will restore my legs, my strength, my honor?" "No, my lord," Yrsa replied honestly. "I cannot restore what has been lost. But I can perhaps make the days more bearable while you decide what manner of man you wish to be with what remains." The words hung in the cold air between them. She had spoken more boldly than any slave should dare, and they both knew it. In the old times, before his fall, such presumption might have cost her dearly. But these were not the old times, and he was no longer the man who had inspired terror in his enemies. "What manner of man?" he repeated slowly, as if tasting foreign words. "Tell me, slave, what manner of man can I be when I cannot even stand to piss without help?" His crude honesty was meant to shock her, to drive her away with the harsh reality of his condition. But Yrsa had tended the sick and dying for years. She had cleaned wounds that would turn strong stomachs, had held the hands of warriors as they drew their final breaths, had witnessed every indignity that flesh was heir to. "The same manner of man you choose to be," she said simply. "Your legs may be broken, Lord Torsten, but your mind remains sharp. Your hands can still hold tools, write words, craft things of beauty or purpose. Your voice can still tell stories, teach young warriors, offer counsel to those who need wisdom more than strength." "Wisdom," he spat. "What wisdom does a broken man possess? That pride comes before a fall? That the gods enjoy humbling mortals who grow too proud? Such wisdom can be learned from any skald's tale." Yrsa set down her bundle and began unpacking her supplies. Small clay pots containing salves made from willow bark and meadowsweet, strips of clean linen, a small knife for cutting away infected tissue. Her movements were efficient and practiced, those of someone who had done this work many times before. "The wisdom of suffering honestly faced," she said as she worked, "of learning to find value in what remains rather than mourning what is lost, of understanding that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to live when death seems easier." Easy words from someone who has never been broken as I am broken. She paused in her preparations and looked directly at him. 8 years ago, raiders came to my village. They killed my parents, burned our home, took me from everything I had ever known. I was 16 years old, and I thought my life was over. For months, I prayed to whatever gods might listen to, let me die rather than live as a slave. Torsten's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing something familiar in her quiet pain. "What changed?" he asked, his voice losing some of its harsh edge. "I realized that my grandmother's knowledge lived in me," Yrsa replied, resuming her work, "that I could honor her memory by using what she had taught me to help others, that even in chains I could choose to be more than just a victim of circumstances." She mixed a preparation of willow bark tea, its bitter smell filling the small hut. I cannot give you back your legs, Lord Torsten, but I can offer you something perhaps more valuable, the chance to discover who you are when stripped of everything you thought defined you. And if what remains is nothing worth preserving, then at least you will know it honestly, she said, offering him the cup. But I suspect there is more to Torsten Fellhand than the strength of his sword arm. The man who united 3 warring clans through diplomacy before ever drawing his weapon, that man had wisdom. The warrior who gave half his share of battle spoils to widows and orphans, that man had compassion. The leader who never asked his followers to face dangers he would not face himself, that man had honor. Torsten stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. How do you know these things? Such details are not spoken of in the general telling of my deeds. Slaves hear many things that free men do not expect, Yrsa said with a small smile. We clean the halls where warriors drink and boast. We tend the wounds of men who speak honestly in their pain. We know which leaders are truly respected by their followers and which are merely feared. He accepted the cup from her hands, their fingers brushing briefly. His hands, she noted, were warm and steady despite his condition. There was strength there still, even if it could no longer wield a warhammer in battle. Why do you risk this? He asked quietly. Helping me brings you no benefit and considerable danger if you are discovered. Why does a slave care what becomes of a fallen warrior? Yrsa considered her answer carefully. How could she explain that seeing greatness brought low made her heart ache, not with satisfaction at the mighty being humbled, but with genuine sorrow for human suffering? How could she tell him that his pain called to something deep within her, the part that had always felt compelled to heal what was broken, to nurture what was wounded? Because abandoning you would make me less than I choose to be, she said finally, and because I believe that how we treat those who can no longer help themselves says more about our own character than any amount of strength or glory ever could. For the first time since his return, Torsten's lips curved in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Dangerous words, slave. Such thinking could change the world. Perhaps it should be changed, Yrsa replied, beginning to clean the pressure sores that had formed during his days of lying motionless. Perhaps a world that discards people the moment they become inconvenient is a world that has forgotten what truly matters. As she worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning and treating his wounds, applying salves that would ease the constant ache, Torsten found himself studying this unremarkable woman who had dared to offer kindness where others offered only abandonment. There was something in her calm competence, her quiet strength, that spoke of depths he had never bothered to notice in a slave. "What is your name?" he asked as she finished her ministrations. "Yrsa, my lord." "Just Torsten," he said quietly. "I think I have lost the right to titles." "As you wish," she replied, packing away her supplies. "I will return tomorrow, if you will have me." As she prepared to leave, Torsten called after her, "Yrsa, what you said about finding out who I am when everything else is stripped away, what if that person is someone I do not wish to know?" She paused at the door, looking back at this giant of a man reduced to questioning his very existence. "Then you change him," she said simply. "Day by day, choice by choice, until he becomes someone you can respect. That is perhaps the greatest victory of all, conquering yourself." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Torsten alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of healing herbs. For the first time in weeks, the pain in his body seemed less important than the questions stirring in his mind. Outside, the settlement began to wake, but inside the small hut, a different kind of awakening had begun. 3 days passed before anyone noticed Yrsa's nocturnal journeys. She had been careful, timing her visits during the deepest hours of night when most of the settlement slept soundly. But Gunnar the Wise had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served him well during his years as a trader navigating treacherous negotiations in foreign ports. On the fourth morning, as Yrsa returned from Torsten's hut with her empty medicine bundle, she found Gunnar waiting by the slave quarters, his weathered face unreadable in the grey pre-dawn light. "Interesting paths you walk in the darkness, girl," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to read the truth in people's actions rather than their words. Yrsa's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Running would only confirm his suspicions, and lying to a man known for his ability to detect deception seemed equally futile. "I walk where I am needed," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Gunnar nodded slowly, as if this answer told him everything he needed to know. "And what need drives a slave to risk punishment by visiting our fallen warrior?" The question hung between them like a blade awaiting its target. Yrsa understood that her next words would determine not only her own fate, but possibly Torsten's as well. If Gunnar reported her actions to Jarl Magnus, the best she could hope for was severe punishment. The worst, banishment to the winter wilderness, would mean death for both her and Torsten, who had grown to depend on her care. The need to see that a man who served this clan faithfully for 30 years does not die alone and forgotten, she said, choosing honesty over safe lies. The need to honor the healing knowledge my grandmother taught me, even if it means risking everything. Something shifted in Gunnar's expression, not approval exactly, but perhaps understanding. He had spent decades watching human nature reveal itself in moments of crisis, and he recognized sincerity when he encountered it. "You know the risks," he said. It was not a question. "I do." "And yet you continue." "I do." Gunnar was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When he spoke again, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "My youngest son fell through ice when he was 7 years old. By the time we pulled him from the water, his lips were blue, and his body so cold I thought the life had already left him. The healers declared him beyond saving, said the cold water had taken his spirit, and we should prepare for his death." Yrsa listened, sensing that this story held significance beyond its surface details. But my wife refused to accept their judgment. She worked over that boy for 3 days and 3 nights, warming his body, breathing life into his lungs, forcing warm broth down his throat, drop by drop. The healers said she was wasting her time, that she was prolonging his suffering for no purpose. "What happened?" Yrsa asked softly. "He lived, grew up strong and whole, became a fine warrior in his own right. He died gloriously in battle 5 years ago, defending a merchant ship from Saxon raiders." Gunnar's voice carried both pride and old grief. "But those extra 20 years of life, those were a gift my wife gave him through her stubborn refusal to abandon hope." The implications of his story settled between them like morning mist. Yrsa understood that Gunnar was telling her something important about the nature of healing, about the value of refusing to accept defeat, about the courage required to fight for life when others have given up. "I have not seen what passes between you and Torsten," Gunnar continued, "but I have noticed that the sounds of pain no longer drift from his hut in the deep hours of night. I have observed that he no longer refuses the food brought to him. Small changes, perhaps, but significant ones. He is strong," Yrsa said simply. "Stronger than he knows. Strength comes in many forms," Gunnar agreed. "The question is whether our jarl will recognize this particular form when the time comes to make hard decisions about winter supplies." The warning was clear. Jarl Magnus would soon be forced to calculate how much food the clan could spare during the lean months ahead. Every mouth that consumed supplies without contributing to the clan's survival would face scrutiny. A paralyzed warrior, no matter how legendary his past, would be an obvious candidate for difficult choices. "How long do we have?" Yrsa asked. "The harvest is nearly complete, when the last grain is stored and the winter count is made. Magnus will have to decide who stays and who cannot be supported through the cold months. Perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3. 2 weeks to accomplish what made Torsten valuable enough to the clan that they would choose to keep him alive? The challenge seemed impossible. What could a paralyzed man contribute that would justify the food he consumed, the space he occupied, the care he required? "There is something else you should know," Gunnar said, glancing around to ensure they remained unobserved. "Eric the Redbeard has been asking questions about the fallen warrior. He believes that keeping Torsten alive shows weakness, that it sends the wrong message to potential enemies who might see us as a clan that has grown soft." This news struck Yrsa like a physical blow. Eric was Magnus's chief lieutenant, a man whose counsel carried enormous weight in clan decisions. If he was actively arguing against supporting Torsten, the situation was even more dire than she had imagined. "What would you have me do?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Continue your work," Gunnar replied, "but be prepared for the possibility that kindness alone may not be enough to save him. If Torsten is to survive the winter, he must find a way to prove his value to the clan that goes beyond past glories." As Gunnar walked away, leaving Yrsa alone with her thoughts and fears, she realized that their time together had become a race against the approaching winter, both the literal cold that would force hard choices about survival and the metaphorical winter of despair that threatened to consume Torsten's will to live. That evening, as she prepared her usual collection of healing supplies, Yrsa found herself considering new approaches to their situation. The herbs and salves she carried could ease Torsten's physical pain, but they could not address the deeper wound to his sense of purpose and self-worth. If he was to survive, he needed more than medical care. He needed a reason to fight for his own life. The solution, when it came to her, was both simple and dangerous. Instead of just treating Torsten's wounds, she would need to challenge him to discover new strengths, new ways to contribute to the clan's welfare. It would mean pushing him beyond the comfortable despair he had settled into, forcing him to confront the possibility that his life might still have meaning and value. But first, she would need to convince him that the effort was worthwhile, and given his current state of mind, that might prove the most difficult healing of all. As she made her way through the darkness toward his hut, Yrsa carried with her not just medicines for the body, but a new determination to heal the spirit of a man who had forgotten his own worth. The wind carried the scent of coming snow, reminder that winter would not wait for their healing to be complete. Time was running short, and the stakes had never been higher. The carved, wooden chess pieces sat between them like tiny warriors frozen in eternal combat, their painted surfaces gleaming in the flickering candlelight. Yrsa had found the game board gathering dust in a corner of Torsten's hut, apparently forgotten since his injury. When she had suggested they play while his evening poultices took effect, he had looked at her as if she had proposed something scandalous. "Chess is a warrior's game," he had protested. "A test of tactical thinking, of strategic planning. What would a slave know of such things? Perhaps more than you imagine," Yrsa had replied, already setting up the pieces with practiced efficiency. "My father was a minor lord before the raids. He believed that understanding strategy was as important for a daughter as needlework or herb lore." Now, 3 moves into their first game, Torsten was beginning to reassess his assumptions about the quiet woman who had become his unlikely caregiver. Her opening gambit had been both elegant and aggressive, revealing a grasp of chess theory that spoke of years of serious study. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Torsten said, studying the board with renewed attention. "Not many lords bothered teaching their daughters the arts of war. He said that in an uncertain world, everyone might someday need to think like a general," Yrsa replied, moving her knight to threaten his bishop. That knowledge was the one treasure that raiders could never steal if it was properly hidden in the mind. Torsten's hand hovered over his pieces, considering responses to her unexpected attack. It had been months since he had engaged in serious tactical thinking, and he found his mind struggling to shake off the rust of disuse. "Yet they stole everything else," he observed. not unkindly. "Yes," she said simply, "but they left me alive to carry his teachings forward. Perhaps that is a kind of victory." As they played, their conversation ranged across topics that had nothing to do with Torsten's condition or Yrsa's status as a slave. They discussed the merits of different battle formations, the challenge of governing unruly populations, the delicate balance required to maintain alliances between rival clans. Torsten found himself drawn into debates about strategy and leadership that reminded him how much he had enjoyed the intellectual aspects of command. "You realize what you are doing," he said after she captured his rook with a brilliantly conceived sacrifice. "Playing chess, reminding me that my mind still functions, even if my legs do not." He moved his king to safety, but they both knew she had gained a decisive advantage. "Making me think about something other than what I have lost." Yrsa considered her next move carefully, both on the board and in their conversation. "Is it working?" "Perhaps." Torsten leaned back against his pillows, studying her face in the candlelight. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at me?" The question was more vulnerable than anything he had yet shared, and Yrsa treated it with the gravity it deserved. "I see a man learning to discover who he is when stripped of everything he thought defined him," she said. "Someone fighting to find new purpose in a world that no longer recognizes his old value. And what do you think that new purpose might be?" "Only you can answer that," she replied, moving her queen to set up checkmate in 3 moves. "But I suspect it has something to do with all the knowledge locked away in your mind, 30 years of experience in leadership, tactics, diplomacy, and war. Knowledge that could benefit this clan in ways that have nothing to do with swinging a hammer." Torsten saw the inevitable conclusion to their game and tipped over his king in acknowledgement of defeat. "You play well for someone who learned from a dead father." "I have had 8 years to practice against myself," Yrsa said with a slight smile, "and recently I have been imagining games against the greatest tactical mind in Skarnheim." "Flattery will not save you from losing the next game," he warned, but his tone carried humor rather than bitterness. "We shall see," she replied, beginning to reset the pieces. As they played their second game, Torsten found himself sharing memories of past campaigns, not the glorious battles that the Skalds celebrated, but the complex decisions that had made victory possible. How he had convinced 3 rival clans to unite against a common enemy. How he had negotiated safe passage through hostile territory by understanding what each party truly needed. How he had resolved disputes within his own forces through careful attention to honor and pride. "These are the skills that built your reputation," Yrsa observed as she considered a particularly difficult position. "Not just your strength, but your wisdom." "Wisdom requires the authority to implement it," Torsten replied. "What good is strategic thinking if no one will listen to your counsel?" "Authority comes in many forms," she said, moving her bishop to create a complex tactical threat. "Sometimes it comes from rank or strength, but sometimes it comes from simply being right about things that matter." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the hut. Both froze, suddenly aware of how their evening had changed from a medical visit to something approaching friendship. If someone discovered them playing chess together, talking as equals rather than master and slave, it could mean severe punishment for both. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the moment had shattered their comfortable isolation. The reality of their situation, a slave caring for a disgraced warrior in defiance of clan expectations, crashed back over them like cold water. "I should go," Yrsa said quietly, beginning to pack away the chess pieces. "Yes," Torsten agreed, though his voice carried reluctance. "But perhaps tomorrow we might finish this game, if you wish." As she gathered her supplies, Torsten watched her with new appreciation. The woman he had initially dismissed as just another slave had revealed depths of intelligence and strength that commanded respect. More than that, she had given him something he had not realized. He desperately needed the experience of being valued for his mind rather than his physical prowess. "Yrsa," he called as she reached the door. When I was young, my father told me that the greatest warriors were not those who never fell, but those who learned to rise stronger each time they were knocked down. I am beginning to understand what he meant. Tomorrow we shall see if you can apply that wisdom to our chess game, she replied. But her smile carried warmth that had nothing to do with their competition. After she left, Torsten lay in the darkness thinking about their evening together. For the first time since his injury, he had felt like himself again, not the broken shadow of a legendary warrior, but a man capable of thought, strategy, and meaningful conversation. It was a small beginning, but perhaps it was enough to build upon. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of serious winter, but inside the small hut, something new was growing that might prove strong enough to survive the cold months ahead. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a nervous young warrior who could barely meet Yrsa's eyes. "Jarl Magnus requires your presence in the great hall," he stammered, his hand unconsciously moving to his sword hilt, as if her very existence made him uncomfortable. Yrsa's stomach clenched with dread, but she forced her expression to remain calm. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her nocturnal visits to Torsten would be brought before the clan's leadership for judgment. She had simply hoped for more time to help Torsten find his footing before facing this reckoning. "I will come at once," she replied, setting down the basket of mending she had been working on. Around her, the other slaves watched with the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves during times of trouble. The great hall of Skarnheim never failed to impress with its massive timber beams and soaring ceiling. Shields and weapons from countless battles hung from the walls, creating shadows that danced in the light of the central fire pit. At the head table, Jarl Magnus sat in his carved chair, flanked by his closest advisors. Eric the Redbeard stood at his right hand, his weathered face set in grim lines. But it was the object placed on the table before Magnus that made Yrsa's heart skip her small cloth bundle of herbs and healing supplies. The one she had accidentally left behind in Torsten's hut the previous evening, in her haste to return before full daylight. "Approach, Yrsa of the Scottish shores," Magnus commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. As she walked the length of the hall, her footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the wooden floor, Yrsa felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Warriors, craftsmen, servants, all had gathered to witness whatever judgment was about to unfold. In the Norse world, such public proceedings served as both entertainment and education, showing everyone present the consequences of stepping beyond accepted boundaries. She stopped before the high table and bowed her head respectfully, though not in the servile manner some might have expected. Years of slavery had taught her the value of dignity, even in submission. "Do you recognize these items?" Magnus asked, gesturing to the bundle on the table. "I do, my lord. They were found in the hut of our former warrior Torsten Fellhand. How do you explain their presence there?" Yrsa had considered many possible responses during her walk to the hall, but in the end she chose the same honesty that had served her in her conversation with Gunnar. Lies would only complicate matters, and the truth, however dangerous, at least had the virtue of simplicity. "I brought them there, my lord, to ease his suffering and treat his wounds." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Eric the Redbeard stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt in a gesture that was both casual and threatening. "By what authority does a slave presume to treat one who was once our greatest warrior?" Eric demanded. "What knowledge could you possibly possess that our own healers lack?" "Knowledge taught to me by my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before her," Yrsa replied. "The knowledge of plants and their properties, of how to ease pain and promote healing. As for authority, I claim none beyond that which comes from seeing suffering and being unable to ignore it." "Suffering?" Eric spat. "The man is already dead in everything but name. You waste medicines that could better serve those who still contribute to this clan's welfare." "With respect, Lord Eric, I believe you are mistaken." The silence that followed her contradiction was so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed loud as thunder. No slave had ever dared to contradict Eric the Redbeard in open hall. The audacity of it left even the most experienced warriors speechless. "Explain yourself," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that one wrong word could mean her death. Yrsa took a steadying breath. Everything depended on the next few moments, not just her own life, but Torsten's as well. If she could not convince them of his continued value, they would likely both face banishment before the day was through. "Torsten Fellhand's body may be broken, but his mind remains sharp as any blade," she began. "In the evenings, as I tend his wounds, he has shared with me insights into strategy and leadership that reveal depths of wisdom earned through 30 years of command. He speaks of diplomatic solutions that prevented bloodshed, of tactical innovations that saved countless lives, of the delicate balance required to maintain unity among strong-willed warriors." "Pretty words," Eric interrupted. "But what use is wisdom from a man who cannot act upon it? What good are strategies from someone who will never again lead troops into battle?" "Perhaps the greatest value," Yrsa said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "A wise advisor need not swing a sword to influence the outcome of conflicts. A strategic mind can plan campaigns from any chair, whether it stands in a place of honor or sits beside a humble fire." The knowledge in Torsten's head represents 3 decades of hard-won experience. Are we so wealthy in wisdom that we can afford to waste such a resource? Gunnar the Wise, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his chair. "The girl raises an interesting point," he said thoughtfully. "We have young warriors with strong backs but little experience in leadership. Perhaps there is value in preserving the knowledge of one who has faced challenges they have yet to encounter." "Knowledge can be shared without maintaining the man who possesses it," Eric countered. "Let him speak his wisdom to those who can use it, then allow nature to take its course." "And when those young warriors face situations not covered in hasty conversations," Yrsa asked, surprising herself with her boldness, "when they need counsel in the moment of crisis, guidance that can only come from someone who has lived through similar challenges? Dead advisors offer poor counsel." Magnus had been listening to this exchange with the calculating attention of a man accustomed to weighing complex decisions. Now he raised his hand for silence, and the hall fell quiet once more. "You speak passionately in defense of one who was once our enemy's nightmare," he said to Yrsa. "Tell me, what do you gain from preserving his life? What benefit comes to a slave from saving a fallen warrior?" The question struck to the heart of her motivations, forcing her to examine her own reasons for the risks she had taken. What did drive her to help Torsten? Was it mere compassion, or something deeper? "Nothing, my lord," she answered finally. "I gain nothing but the knowledge that I chose to act according to my conscience rather than my convenience. But perhaps the question should not be what I gain, but what we all lose if we discard valuable people simply because they can no longer serve in the ways they once did. Today it is Torsten who faces this judgment. Tomorrow it might be any warrior who suffers serious injury, any craftsman who grows too old for his trade, any person who becomes inconvenient rather than useful." Her words hung in the air like a challenge to the very foundations of their society. She had not merely argued for Torsten's life, but questioned the wisdom of a culture that measured worth solely by immediate utility. Magnus leaned back in his chair, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore and the soft whisper of wind through the hall's high rafters. "Bring him," Magnus commanded finally, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade through silk. "If Torsten Fellhand's mind remains as valuable as this slave claims, let him demonstrate it before us all." Eric the Redbeard's face darkened with displeasure. "My lord, surely you do not intend to subject the clan to the spectacle of parading our fallen?" "I intend to make an informed decision," Magnus interrupted sharply. "If this man possesses wisdom worth preserving, I would hear it from his own lips rather than through the words of others, however well-intentioned. 4 warriors departed to retrieve Torsten, leaving Yrsa standing before the assembled clan like a defendant awaiting judgment. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, some curious, others hostile, all waiting to see whether her bold claims would prove justified or merely the desperate lies of someone trying to save her own skin along with Torsten's. The wait stretched endlessly, filled only with the crackling of the fire and the occasional whispered comment from the watching crowd. Yrsa tried to prepare herself for what was coming, but the truth was that she had no idea what state of mind Torsten would be in when faced with this public examination. Their evening conversations had shown her glimpses of his returning confidence, but this would be a far more severe test than chess games played in the privacy of his hut. When the warriors finally returned, carrying Torsten on a wooden litter, Yrsa's heart clenched at the sight of him. Even though she had helped prepare him for this moment, seeing him brought into the great hall like an invalid rather than striding in, as the proud warrior he had once been, was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held his head high despite his circumstances, that spoke of a man who had not entirely surrendered to despair. His dark hair had been braided in the traditional warrior fashion, and he wore his finest tunic, small gestures of pride that suggested he understood the importance of this moment. The litter-bearers placed him before the high table, where all could see him clearly. For a moment, the hall fell completely silent, as clan members who had not seen their former champion since his return took in the reality of his condition. Some faces showed pity, others disgust, but most revealed the uncomfortable uncertainty of people confronted with mortality and the fragility of human strength. Torsten Fellhand, Magnus began, his voice formal but not unkind. This slave claims that your mind retains value to our clan despite your physical condition. She argues that wisdom earned through 30 years of leadership should not be discarded simply because your body can no longer wield weapons in our defense. What say you to these claims? Torsten's response would determine both their fates, and Yrsa found herself holding her breath as he considered his words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority that had once commanded armies, though it was tempered now with a humility born of suffering. I say that she speaks more kindly of my abilities than perhaps I deserve, he began, earning a few surprised chuckles from the assembled warriors. But I also say that experience once gained does not disappear simply because the body that gained it becomes broken. The battles I have fought, the decisions I have made, the mistakes I have learned from these remain with me regardless of whether I can walk or stand. Eric stepped forward, clearly determined to expose what he saw as empty boasting. Fine words, but let us test them with reality. Young Bjorn here, he gestured to a warrior of perhaps 25 years, leads a raid next week against Saxon settlements along the coast. What wisdom would you offer him that our other experienced warriors could not provide? It was a clever challenge, forcing Torsten to demonstrate his value in practical terms while highlighting his inability to participate personally in the action he was advising. Yrsa watched nervously as Torsten studied young Bjorn, taking in details of his bearing, his equipment, his obvious eagerness for glory. I would tell him that eager young warriors often mistake speed for efficiency, Torsten said thoughtfully. That the Saxons he seeks to raid have had all summer to prepare their defenses, and that approaching their settlements directly will likely result in heavier casualties than necessary. He paused, clearly organizing his thoughts. I would suggest that he study the tidal patterns carefully. Saxon coastal defenses are always weaker during high tide when their boats can be moved quickly, but their escape routes become limited. I would recommend timing the attack for the hour before dawn on a day when thick fog is likely, using the weather as cover for approach and withdrawal. Bjorn's eyes had widened with interest, and several other young warriors leaned forward to better hear Torsten's words. This was clearly knowledge they had not considered, practical wisdom that could mean the difference between successful raid and devastating defeat. Furthermore, Torsten continued, warming to his subject, I would warn him that Saxon settlements often have hidden watchtowers positioned to observe approaching ships. These are typically built into natural rock formations or disguised as fishing huts. A wise raider scouts these positions days in advance and neutralizes them silently before the main attack. The hall had grown completely quiet. Everyone absorbed in listening to tactical advice that could save lives and ensure success. Even Eric seemed impressed, despite his obvious reluctance to acknowledge Torsten's continuing value. And finally, Torsten concluded, I would remind young Bjorn that the true measure of a successful raid is not just what treasure is gained, but how many of his men return safely to share in the victory. Glory that costs too many lives is no glory at all. Magnus nodded slowly, clearly weighing what he had heard. Practical wisdom indeed. But can you offer counsel beyond matters of war? Our challenges are not always solved with sword and shield. Test me, Torsten replied simply. Magnus considered for a moment, then posed a question that Yrsa knew had been troubling him for months. The clan of Ironshore has approached us about a marriage alliance between their jarl's daughter and our young warriors. They offer substantial dowry and promise of mutual defense, but they also expect us to provide significant bride price and commit to supporting their territorial disputes with neighboring clans. How do we evaluate such an offer? Torsten's response demonstrated the breadth of his experience beyond simple warfare. He spoke knowledgeably about the political implications of various alliance structures, the economic calculations involved in bride price negotiations, and the long-term strategic value of different types of partnerships. His analysis revealed a sophisticated understanding of diplomacy that impressed even Gunnar the Wise, who had handled such negotiations for decades. As Torsten spoke, Yrsa watched the faces of the assembled clan members gradually shift from skepticism to genuine interest. Here was wisdom that could benefit them all, knowledge that had been earned through decades of hard experience and careful observation. Perhaps more importantly, it was knowledge that none of their younger leaders possessed, making it genuinely valuable rather than merely redundant. When Magnus finally called for silence, the hall buzzed with quiet conversations as people discussed what they had heard. The demonstration had clearly exceeded expectations, proving that Torsten's mind remained as sharp as ever despite his physical limitations. But Eric the Redbeard was not yet finished with his opposition. Impressive words, he admitted grudgingly, but wisdom without the ability to act upon it remains merely entertainment. What happens when this counsel conflicts with the desires of those who must actually implement it? What authority does a broken man possess to ensure his advice is followed? The question struck at the heart of the matter, challenging not just Torsten's practical value, but the very nature of leadership itself. Could wisdom command respect without the backing of physical strength? In their warrior culture, authority had always flowed from demonstrated prowess in battle. How could that tradition accommodate a leader who could no longer prove himself through combat? Torsten's answer would determine whether this demonstration had been enough to save his life, or whether all of Yrsa's efforts had merely postponed the determined inevitable. Torsten met Eric's challenging gaze with steady eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the entire hall lean forward to listen. "You ask what authority I possess," he said quietly. "Allow me to tell you of authority I once witnessed, and perhaps you will understand that power comes in forms we do not always recognize." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and Yrsa noticed how the flickering firelight played across his weathered features, highlighting the lines carved by years of responsibility and decision. 20 years ago, I served under Jarl Eriksson of Northwind during the Great Siege of Ravenshollow. For 3 months, we battered ourselves against their walls, while our supplies dwindled and our men grew restless. Eriksson commanded through fear and force, demanding obedience through threats of punishment. When our siege engines failed, he ordered frontal attacks that cost us hundreds of men for no gain. When disease struck our camp, he blamed the gods and ordered more sacrifices. The hall was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in this tale from their legendary warriors past. But there was another man in that army, a greybeard named Olaf, who held no formal rank, who could barely lift a sword due to his age, who commanded nothing but the respect earned through 60 years of hard-won wisdom. When Eriksson's strategies failed repeatedly, it was to Olaf that the younger warriors quietly turned for counsel. It was Olaf who suggested the weakness in the eastern wall. Olaf, who knew the seasonal patterns of the river that supplied their water. Olaf, who understood that siege warfare is won through patience and intelligence rather than brute force. Torsten shifted on his litter, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. When the final assault came, it was Olaf's plan we followed, not Eriksson's. The jarl gave the orders, yes, but every warrior in that army knew whose wisdom had made victory possible. And when Olaf died the following winter peacefully, in his bed, having never again lifted a weapon, his funeral drew men from 5 different clans, who came to honor not his strength, but his wisdom. A pretty tale, Eric said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. But what does it prove? It proves that true authority comes not from the ability to command obedience through fear, but from the respect earned by consistently offering counsel that proves valuable. A man who speaks wisdom will be heard, regardless of whether he can enforce his words with sword and shield. Magnus leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued by both the story and its implications. You speak of earning respect through wise counsel, but respect, once lost, can be difficult to regain. How do we know that your judgment remains sound after such a devastating fall? It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of Torsten's situation. How could a man who had failed to protect himself from falling rocks be trusted with decisions that might affect the entire clan's welfare? Torsten's answer surprised everyone, including Yrsa. Because, he said slowly, my fall has taught me something I never understood during my years of victory, the true cost of failure, and therefore the real value of careful decision-making. When success comes easily, when strength seems sufficient to overcome any obstacle, it becomes easy to take risks without fully considering their consequences. But a man who has lost everything he valued understands the weight of each choice in ways that the perpetually victorious never can. He paused, his gaze finding Yrsa's face in the crowd. Moreover, this experience has shown me perspectives I never possessed when I stood at the height of my power. I have learned what it means to depend on the kindness of others, to see value in gentleness as well as strength, to understand that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted near the hall's entrance. The great doors burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and 3 travel-stained warriors whose urgent manner immediately commanded attention. "My lord," the lead warrior called out, dropping to one knee before Magnus. "We bring urgent news from the southern reaches. A Saxon warband of unprecedented size has been spotted moving up the coast, perhaps 200 men, well-armed and organized. They burn every settlement in their path and show no interest in negotiation or ransom. The clans of Ironwood and Deep Fjord have already fallen. They will reach our lands within days." The news hit the assembly like a physical blow. 200 Saxons represented a force larger than any that had threatened their region in living memory. Even combined with their allies, Skarnheim could barely field half that number of warriors. Magnus rose from his chair, his face grim with the weight of sudden crisis. "How many days do we have?" 3. "Perhaps 4, if the weather slows their advance," the messenger replied. "But my lord, there is more. They are led by someone who knows our ways intimately. Their advanced scouts move like Norse warriors. They avoid our traditional defensive positions. They strike at times and places that suggest knowledge of our customs and weaknesses. Eric the Redbeard stepped forward, his earlier concerns about Torsten suddenly seeming far less important in the face of immediate danger. A traitor among us? Or a Saxon who has studied our methods extensively? Gunnar suggested grimly. Either way, we face an enemy who will not be defeated by conventional tactics. The hall erupted in urgent discussion as warriors debated response options, each voice adding to the chaos of overlapping conversations. Some advocated immediate evacuation to more defensible positions. Others argued for gathering their allies and meeting the threat head-on. A few suggested attempting to negotiate with the invaders, though this option found little support among the assembled fighters. It was Torsten who cut through the babble with a single sharp observation. "You are all thinking like the enemy expects you to think," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite his prone position. The authority in his tone was so complete that the entire hall fell silent. "They have studied our ways, learned our weaknesses, prepared for our traditional responses. Therefore, we must respond in ways they cannot anticipate." Magnus turned toward the litter, and Yrsa saw something change in the jarl's expression, a shift from polite attention to genuine interest in what his former champion might offer. "Speak," Magnus commanded. "First, we must determine exactly what they know and how they learned it," Torsten began, his tactical mind clearly engaging with the crisis. "If there is a traitor, we need to identify them before they can provide further intelligence to our enemies. If their leader is simply well studied in our methods, we need to understand the extent of their knowledge." He paused, organizing his thoughts with the same care he had once applied to planning major campaigns. "Second, we must abandon any strategy that relies on doing what we have always done. If they know our defensive positions, we choose new ones. If they expect us to fight in traditional formation, we adopt tactics they have never seen. If they anticipate our timing, we move when they least expect it. And how do you propose we accomplish this miracle of innovation?" Eric asked, though his tone had shifted from skepticism to genuine inquiry. "By combining our traditional strengths with approaches borrowed from our enemies and allies," Torsten replied. "The Irish use small, mobile units to harass larger forces. The Franks employ coordinated cavalry charges that can break shield walls. The Saxons themselves favor defensive positions that channel attackers into killing zones. We take the best of all these methods and create something our enemy has never faced." Magnus nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the breadth of Torsten's knowledge and the speed with which he had analyzed their situation. "Specific recommendations?" For the next several minutes, Torsten outlined a defense strategy unlike anything Skarnheim had previously attempted. He proposed dividing their forces into multiple small units that could strike quickly and disappear, using the terrain to their advantage rather than meeting the enemy in open battle. He suggested ways to use their superior knowledge of local geography to create traps and ambushes. Most importantly, he recommended a coordinated plan that would make the Saxons' greater numbers work against them by stretching their forces across multiple simultaneous threats. As he spoke, the assembled warriors found themselves nodding in agreement, recognizing the tactical brilliance of his proposals. Here was the strategic mind that had made Torsten Fellhand legendary, applied now to their most desperate crisis. When he finished, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Finally, young Bjorn spoke up from the crowd of warriors. "Lord Torsten," he said formally, "would you be willing to serve as strategic advisor for this campaign, to help us implement these plans and adapt them as circumstances require?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between past and future, between the man Torsten had been and the man he might yet become. Yrsa held her breath, knowing that his answer would determine not just the outcome of the coming battle, but the direction of both their lives. More than that, It would reveal whether a warrior could find new purpose when his old identity had been stripped away, whether wisdom could prove as valuable as strength in their unforgiving world. The 3 days that followed transformed Skarnheim from a peaceful settlement into a hive of purposeful activity. Torsten's acceptance of his role as strategic, the advisor, had galvanized the entire clan, giving direction to what might otherwise have been panicked preparation. From his position in the Great Hall, where his litter had been placed near the planning tables, he coordinated the most complex defensive operation in the clan's history. Yrsa found herself at the center of this whirlwind of activity, no longer just a slave tending a fallen warrior, but an essential link between Torsten and the fighters who would implement his strategies. Her knowledge of herb lore had proven invaluable in preparing field medicines, while her quick mind and careful attention to detail made her an ideal messenger for carrying complex instructions between the strategic center and the various preparation teams. The eastern ridge positions must be completed by tomorrow's dawn, Torsten was saying to a group of young warriors gathered around his makeshift command post. Remember, these are not traditional defensive positions meant to stop an advance. They are harassment points designed to slow the enemy and channel them toward our primary killing ground. Speed of withdrawal is more important than holding territory. Eric the Redbeard, who had become one of Torsten's most effective lieutenants once the crisis shifted his priorities, nodded grimly as he studied the carefully drawn maps spread across the table. The withdrawal routes have been marked and cleared. Each position has 3 separate escape paths, and supply caches have been positioned at every fallback point. Good, Torsten replied. What word from the southern scouts? The Saxon advance continues steadily, Gunnar reported, consulting a collection of message strips that had arrived throughout the day. They burned Oakenford yesterday and should reach our outer markers by tomorrow afternoon. The refugees who escaped confirm your assessment. Their leader moves like someone intimately familiar with Norse tactics. Torsten's jaw tightened with concentration. This detail continued to trouble him more than any other aspect of their situation. An enemy who understood their methods posed challenges that went beyond simple numerical disadvantage. Have we learned anything more about this leader? He asked. Only rumors and fragments, Eric replied. Some survivors speak of a tall man with Nordic features but Saxon dress. Others mention someone who gives orders in perfect Norse before translating them for his followers. But in the chaos of attack, reliable observation becomes difficult. Yrsa, who had been quietly organizing medical supplies nearby, looked up from her work. Could it be someone we know? A warrior who left the clan years ago, perhaps bearing some grudge? The suggestion sent a chill through the gathered men. The possibility that they faced not just an enemy, but a personal betrayer, added a layer of bitter complexity to their situation. We have had our share of exiles over the years, Magnus said thoughtfully. Men who disagreed with clan decisions or faced punishment for serious crimes. Most seek new lives in distant lands, but a few might harbor resentment deep enough to motivate such revenge. The identity of our enemy matters less than understanding his capabilities, Torsten said pragmatically. Whether traitor or scholar, he knows enough about our methods to anticipate conventional responses. Our advantage lies in doing what he cannot predict. As evening approached, the final preparations reached a fever pitch. Weapons were sharpened and distributed. Armor was checked and adjusted. Food was prepared and packed for warriors who might spend days in the field. Children and elderly were moved to the most defensible positions where they could be protected if the primary defense lines failed. But perhaps the most crucial work was being done in Torsten's corner of the Great Hall, where he continued refining the intricate plan that would determine their survival. Unlike traditional Norse battle strategies, which relied on clear lines of authority and straightforward tactics, this defense required precise coordination between multiple small units operating independently across a wide area. The success of this entire operation depends on timing, he explained to his assembled sub-commanders. Each unit must strike at exactly the right moment and withdraw before the enemy can respond effectively. Too early, and we reveal our positions without maximum impact. Too late, and our forces become trapped in prolonged combat they cannot win. Young Bjorn, who had volunteered to lead the most dangerous harassment missions, studied the timeline Torsten had developed with careful attention. How do we coordinate without horns or signals that might alert the enemy to our presence? Through careful observation and predetermined decision points, Torsten replied. Each unit will know exactly what to watch for and when to act based on the enemy's movements, rather than external signals. It requires trust in your comrades and confidence in the plan, but it allows for perfect surprise. Yrsa marveled at the transformation she witnessed in both Torsten and the warriors around him. Where days before he had been a broken man, questioning his own worth, he now commanded attention and respect through the simple expedient of consistently offering valuable counsel. The warriors who had once viewed him as a shameful burden now sought his approval and feared disappointing his expectations. More remarkably, she saw how his new role was healing something in his spirit that went beyond mere purpose. The isolation and despair that had characterized his first weeks after the injury were being replaced by a sense of connection and contribution that seemed to restore his essential humanity. "You should rest," she said quietly during a brief lull in the planning sessions. "Tomorrow will demand everything you have to give." "Rest seems impossible when so many lives hang in the balance," he replied, but his voice carried exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "Every detail I overlook, every possibility I fail to anticipate, could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat." "You cannot account for everything," she reminded him gently. "At some point, you must trust in the wisdom of your planning and the courage of those who will implement it." Torsten looked at her with something approaching wonder. How did a slave maiden become so wise in matters of leadership and strategy? "Perhaps by watching greatness closely enough to understand how it works," she replied with a small smile. "And by learning that wisdom often comes disguised as simple common sense." As the night wore on, final reports arrived from the outer scouts. The Saxon force had made camp less than a day's march from Skarnheim's territory, apparently confident in their ability to overwhelm whatever resistance they might encounter. Their leader had posted guards and organized his forces with professional competence, but showed no sign of expecting the unconventional defense that awaited them. "They move like a traditional war band," the chief scout reported. "Disciplined, but predictable. Their leader may understand our methods, but he appears to be following standard Saxon doctrine for the actual approach." "Excellent," Torsten said with satisfaction. "Overconfidence in superior numbers often leads to tactical carelessness. If they expect easy victory, they may not take proper precautions against unexpected threats." Magnus, who had spent the evening observing Torsten's work with growing respect, approached the planning table as the final preparations concluded. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you returned broken from the mountains, I saw only what you could no longer do. I failed to recognize what you might yet accomplish." "No apology needed," Torsten replied. "I saw the same emptiness when I looked at myself. It took someone with clearer vision to help me understand that usefulness takes many forms." His gaze found Yrsa's face across the hall, and she felt the warmth of gratitude and something deeper pass between them. Their relationship had begun with simple compassion for suffering, but it had grown into something approaching genuine partnership, two people who brought out strengths in each other that neither had known they possessed. "The clan owes both of you a debt that cannot easily be repaid," Magnus continued. "Your wisdom may save us all, and her courage in preserving that wisdom when others would have discarded it shows a quality of character we should all aspire to match." As the great hall finally began to empty, With warriors departing for their assigned positions and final preparations, Torsten found himself alone with Yrsa for the first time since the crisis had begun. The maps and plans lay spread between them like the blueprints for their shared future. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. "Terrified," he admitted honestly. "Not of death, I made peace with that possibility long ago, but of failure, of leading good men into disaster because my judgment has been clouded by desperation or pride." "Your judgment has been tested repeatedly over these past days," she reminded him. "Every warrior in this clan has come to trust your counsel. Perhaps it is time you trusted it as well." "And what of you?" he asked. "Tomorrow you will tend wounded men in conditions far more dangerous than anything you have faced as a slave. Are you prepared for what may come?" Yrsa considered the question seriously. She had indeed volunteered to serve as a field healer during the coming battle, knowing that her skills might mean the difference between life and death for wounded warriors. It would place her directly in harm's way, far from the relative safety of her former anonymity. "I am prepared to do what needs doing," she said finally. "Just as you are prepared to lead, despite your fears. Perhaps courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing to act properly in spite of it." As dawn approached, bringing with it the most crucial day in Skarnheim's history, both of them understood that everything they had built together, their friendship, their mutual respect, their shared sense of purpose, would be tested in ways that no amount of planning could fully prepare them for. The battle ahead would determine not just the survival of their clan, but whether the new identities they had discovered in each other could withstand the ultimate trial of fire and blood. The morning mist hung thick over the valley as the Saxon warband approached Skarnheim's outer defences. From his elevated position overlooking the main approach, Torsten watched through a gap in the rocks as 200 enemy warriors moved with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. Their leader rode at the front of the column, a tall figure whose bearing seemed oddly familiar even at this distance. Yrsa crouched beside Torsten's litter, her healer's bag prepared for the wounded who would inevitably come. Around them, hidden among the carefully prepared positions, 40 Norse warriors waited in absolute silence for the signal to begin the most crucial battle of their lives. "They move exactly as predicted," Eric whispered, consulting the tactical notes Torsten had prepared. "Advanced scouts followed by the main force, expecting traditional defensive positions that no longer exist." Through hand signals, passed silently from position to position, word spread that the enemy had reached the first trigger point. Torsten felt his heart racing as months of theoretical planning suddenly became deadly reality. Everything depended on the next few moments, whether his untested strategy could work against an enemy who understood Norse tactics better than any foreign invader should. The Saxon advance scouts moved cautiously through the abandoned outer settlements, finding them empty as expected, but clearly puzzled by the complete absence of defensive preparations. No shield walls, no blocked paths, no obvious attempts to slow their progress. It was exactly what Torsten had hoped. They would find nothing that would alert them to the trap being prepared. "First harassment unit, prepare," Eric signaled. And 20 warriors in the eastern positions readied their weapons. The main Saxon force had entered the valley proper now, spreading out into standard formation for assaulting a fortified position. Their leader gestured confidently toward the great hall visible in the distance, apparently planning a direct assault that would overwhelm any defenders through sheer numbers. It was then that Torsten got his first clear look at the enemy commander, and his blood turned to ice. "Ivar," he breathed, the name carrying all the weight of old betrayal and bitter recognition. Yrsa looked at him sharply. "You know him? Ivar Bloodaxe, my former lieutenant, exiled 5 years ago for attempting to overthrow Magnus." Torsten's voice carried a mix of anger and grim understanding. "He knows our every defensive position, every traditional strategy, every weakness we possess. No wonder they move with such confidence." The revelation explained everything, how the Saxons had known exactly which settlements to target, how they had avoided the clan's traditional defensive positions, how they had timed their assault for maximum advantage. Ivar had not just joined their enemies, he had become their tactical genius. "He also knows you," Yrsa observed quietly. "Knows your methods, your preferences, your thinking patterns." "Yes," Torsten agreed grimly, "but he knew the old Torsten, the warrior who fought by traditional rules. He cannot know the strategist I have become since my fall." The irony was bitter but potentially crucial. Ivar's knowledge of Torsten's previous methods might actually work against him, causing him to prepare for tactics that would never come. Eric gave the signal, and the first phase of their defense began. 20 Norse warriors erupted from concealed positions along the eastern ridge, raining arrows and spears down on the Saxon flanks before disappearing back into the rocks. The attack lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but its effect was devastating, not just in terms of casualties, but in the confusion it created among men who had expected to face a traditional shield wall. Ivar's response was swift and professional. He wheeled his forces toward the eastern attack, sending 50 men to pursue the fleeing Norse warriors up the treacherous mountain paths. It was exactly what Torsten had hoped, for a significant portion of the Saxon force drawn away from the main assault. But Ivar was too experienced to be completely fooled. Instead of committing his entire force to pursuing the harassment units, he continued advancing toward the Great Hall with his remaining 150 men, clearly recognizing the eastern attack as a diversion rather than the main defense. "He adapts quickly," Torsten observed with grudging respect for his former student's tactical skill. "But he still thinks in terms of overwhelming the central position. He cannot imagine a defense with no center to overwhelm." The second phase began as the Saxons approached what should have been Skarnheim's primary defensive line. Another wave of harassment attacks struck from multiple directions, north, south, and west simultaneously. Small units of Norse warriors appeared just long enough to inflict casualties and create confusion before vanishing again into terrain they knew intimately. Ivar's frustration was becoming visible even at a distance. His forces were taking steady losses without ever getting the chance to engage in the decisive battle they had prepared for. Worse, the multiple small attacks were forcing him to divide his attention and his men exactly as Torsten had planned. "Third phase," Eric signaled, and the most dangerous part of their strategy began. Instead of continuing the harassment pattern, 30 Norse warriors emerged from the southern positions and formed a traditional shield wall, directly blocking the path to the Great Hall. To Ivar, it must have looked like the main defensive force finally revealing itself for the climactic battle he expected. Torsten watched tensely as his former lieutenant took the bait, turning his main force toward this apparent center of resistance. Everything now depended on precise timing and the courage of warriors who were about to face overwhelming odds in order to create the decisive opportunity their survival required. Ivar Bloodaxe charged toward the Norse shield wall with the fury of a man who had finally found the traditional battle he understood. Behind him, 100 Saxon warriors followed in tight formation, their confidence restored by the familiar sight of enemies standing to fight rather than melting away like smoke. "Now," Torsten whispered, and Eric raised the signal that would determine their fate. The false shield wall held its position until the Saxons were committed to their charge, then executed the most difficult maneuver in their entire plan. Instead of fighting, they broke formation and scattered in all directions, leaving Ivar's force rushing toward empty ground with no enemy to engage. But this was not retreat, it was the opening of a trap more deadly than any traditional defense could have provided. As the Saxons charged through the gap where the shield wall had been, they found themselves in a carefully prepared killing zone. Hidden warriors emerged from concealed positions on 3 sides, raining arrows and spears down on men packed too tightly together to maneuver effectively. The narrow valley that had channeled their advance now became a trap from which escape required fighting through the very warriors they thought they were pursuing. Ivar's tactical genius showed itself in his immediate recognition of their predicament. Instead of panicking or attempting to continue the failed charge, he rallied his men into a defensive circle and began fighting his way back toward more open ground where his superior numbers could be brought to bear. "He learns quickly," Torsten observed grimly as he watched his former student adapt to circumstances no Saxon leader should have been able to handle. "But he still thinks like a warrior rather than a strategist." The crucial moment arrived as Ivar's force struggled to escape the killing zone. Erik and his reserves waited in the positions that would block the Saxon withdrawal, but engaging them directly would mean accepting casualties their small force could not afford. Instead, Torsten had planned something more subtle and more dangerous. "Yrsa," he said quietly, "it is time." She nodded, understanding her role in the final phase of their desperate plan. Moving carefully through the concealed paths they had prepared, she made her way toward a position where she could observe the Saxon leader directly. Ivar Bloodaxe was magnificent in battle, his swordwork displaying the skill that had once made him Torsten's most trusted lieutenant. He cut through Norse attackers with practiced efficiency while maintaining control of his increasingly desperate men. But he was also looking for something, scanning the battlefield for any sign of the tactical mind behind this unprecedented defense. "Ivar." Torsten's voice echoed across the valley, amplified by the rock formations that had been chosen specifically for their acoustic properties. "You face the student of war you once were, but you fight against the teacher you helped to create." The Saxon leader's head snapped toward the source of the voice, his eyes widening with shock as he recognized the man he had believed safely removed from any position of influence. "Torsten?" Ivar's response carried across the battlefield with equal clarity. "Impossible. You are broken, finished, no longer a threat to anyone." "I am reborn," Torsten called back, his voice carrying all the authority that had once commanded armies. "Reborn through wisdom earned in suffering, through understanding gained in defeat. You know my old methods, but can you recognize what I have become?" The psychological impact of this exchange was immediate and devastating. Saxon warriors, who had been fighting with confidence, suddenly found themselves wondering what other impossibilities their enemies might have prepared. If the legendary Torsten Fellhand was somehow directing this defense, what other surprises awaited them? More importantly, Ivar's attention was now completely focused on the voice from his past, rather than the immediate tactical situation around him. It was exactly the distraction Torsten had hoped for. Erik struck with perfect timing, leading his reserves in a coordinated assault that cut through the Saxon formation at its weakest point. Instead of attempting to destroy the enemy force completely, which their limited numbers made impossible, the attack was designed to split Ivar's men into two groups, too small to be effective individually. The plan worked with devastating precision. Half the Saxons found themselves cut off from their leader, surrounded by Norse warriors who knew every escape route and defensive position. The other half, including Ivar himself, were forced to retreat toward terrain that favored the defenders at every turn. But Ivar was not finished. Drawing on the tactical knowledge Torsten had taught him years before, he began organizing a fighting withdrawal that threatened to salvage victory from apparent defeat. His remaining men moved with the discipline of veterans, covering each other's retreat while inflicting casualties on their pursuers. "He remembers his lessons too well," Yrsa observed, watching the skilled maneuver from her concealed position. "Then it is time for a lesson he never learned," Torsten replied grimly. The final gambit of their desperate strategy required something no traditional Norse warrior would ever consider: a direct confrontation between the broken teacher and his triumphant student, with everything depending on weapons that had nothing to do with sword or shield. "Signal the final phase," Torsten commanded, and Erik raised the banner that would commit them all to a resolution that would either save Skarnheim or destroy it completely. The final confrontation took place not on a traditional battlefield, but in the ancient stone circle that had served as Skarnheim's meeting place for generations. Ivar Bloodaxe stood alone, his remaining warriors either fled or fallen, while Torsten faced him from his litter, surrounded by the clan that had once considered him worthless. "So it ends between us, teacher," Ivar said, his sword still bloody from the day's fighting. "Though I confess, I never imagined facing you like this, a broken man commanding from a bed while others fight his battles." "This is how leadership truly works," Torsten replied calmly. "Not through personal prowess in combat, but through the wisdom to inspire others to greatness, something you never understood, even when I tried to teach it." Ivar's laugh was bitter. "Wisdom? You call it wisdom to hide behind others while real warriors face death? I remember when Torsten Fellhand led from the front, when men followed him because they knew he would share their dangers." "I remember a different time," Torsten said thoughtfully. "I remember a young warrior so eager for glory that he forgot the purpose of leadership was to protect those who served under him. So hungry for recognition that he would sacrifice his comrades for personal advancement. So proud that he could not accept guidance or correction." The words struck Ivar like physical blows, each one highlighting a character flaw that had ultimately led to his exile and betrayal of his own people. "You exiled me," Ivar snarled. "Cast me out for daring to question your decisions, for suggesting that perhaps the great Torsten Fellhand was not infallible. I exiled you for attempting to assassinate Magnus and seize control of the clan through treachery and murder," Torsten corrected gently, "for choosing personal ambition over the welfare of those you were sworn to protect." Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of old decisions. "Even then, exile seemed too harsh to some of us. But you have proven today that mercy was wasted on a heart that chose hatred over healing." Ivar's eyes swept across the assembled clan members, seeing in their faces not the fear and submission he had expected, but something closer to pity. These were people who had found strength in unity, who had discovered that wisdom could triumph over brute force, who had learned to value compassion alongside courage. "You think you have won something here," he said desperately. "But look at your champion. A cripple who cannot even stand to face his enemies. What kind of victory is this?" It was Yrsa who answered, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength through serving others. "The kind of victory that proves strength comes in many forms," she said simply. "You came here with 200 warriors, expecting to crush us through superior numbers and inside knowledge. Instead, you found yourself outthought and outmaneuvered by a man you considered finished. Perhaps that should teach you something about the nature of true power." Ivar stared at her, this slave who dared to speak to him as an equal, and in that moment something seemed to break inside him. The fury that had sustained him through years of exile and revenge began to crumble, leaving behind only the hollow exhaustion of a man who had built his identity on hatred. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Beg forgiveness from those I tried to destroy? Seek mercy from the man whose life I came here to end?" "I would have you choose," Torsten said quietly. "The same choice I was forced to make when I lay broken and abandoned. You can cling to the man you were, nursing old grievances until they poison everything you touch. Or you can decide to become someone better, someone worthy of the gifts you were given." The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Around them, the members of Skarnheim watched, with the careful attention of people witnessing a moment that would define not just the end of this conflict, but the principles by which they chose to live. Slowly, deliberately, Ivar Bloodaxe let his sword fall to the ground. The metallic ring of steel against stone seemed to echo through the stone circle, like a bell marking the end of an age. "I yield," he said simply, "not to your warriors, but to the wisdom I was too proud to learn when it was freely offered." Magnus nodded gravely. "Then you will face judgment for your crimes. but also the possibility of redemption if you prove worthy of it. As the immediate crisis passed and the clan began the work of treating the wounded and securing their victory, Torsten found himself alone with Yrsa in the quiet of the great hall. The strategic maps that had governed their desperate defense were being carefully stored away, but between them lay the chessboard where their friendship had first begun to grow. "What happens now?" she asked, settling beside his litter with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had found her place in the world. "Now we rebuild," Torsten replied, though his eyes were bright with possibilities he had never imagined during his darkest days. "We take what we have learned about the value of wisdom over strength, of cooperation over domination, and we use it to create something better than what came before." He paused, reaching out to take her hand with the same gentle care she had shown him during his healing. "Magnus has offered to grant you freedom as reward for your service to the clan," he continued. "But I was hoping you might choose to stay, not as a slave, but as someone valued for the gifts you bring to our community." Yrsa's smile carried all the warmth of a woman who had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering others, but from healing what had been broken. "I think," she said softly, "that I have already found my freedom, not through a jarl's decree, but through choosing to care for others, regardless of the cost to myself. That is a freedom no one can grant or take away." Outside, the wind still howled across the fjord, but inside the great hall of Skarnheim, two people who had learned to find strength in gentleness began planning a future that proved wisdom could indeed triumph over force, and that the strongest warriors were sometimes those who chose to lay down their weapons and pick up the tools of healing instead. The age of the sword had not ended, but alongside it, a new age of understanding had begun.